On October 16, 1785, at exactly 7:40 in the morning, the file was marked processed. The clerk noted no variance, despite a missing attachment. The officials followed procedure, applied the stamp, and left quietly. Nothing illegal occurred. No one raised their voice. By the end of the day, it was only a reference number. On the 16th day of October in the year 1785, at precisely 7:40 in the morning, an entry was made in a bound registry of thin, uneven paper, its spine cracked and repaired with twine. The ink was brown, not black, and had bled slightly into the fibers. The line read as follows: Item Walland 42B, Parish District, Eastern Shore, Maryland. Subject transfer. Processed. Verification complete. No variance noted. Attachments: baptismal affirmation, missing. Domestic occupancy note, received. Maternal acknowledgement, filed. Clerical witness mark, verified. M. Reference stamp applied. Routine. A small tick mark sat to the left of the item number, drawn in red pencil, its angle slightly sharper than the others on the page. The registry bore a circular stamp, applied twice by mistake so that the outer ring overlapped itself, blurring the date. One corner of the page had been folded down and smoothed flat again. No further notes followed. The next entry began immediately beneath it, unrelated. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, lighter and less practiced, a notation read, Count verified. Beside it was a check mark, long and deliberate, extending into the margin. A small smear suggested the clerk had lifted his pen too late. The ledger was closed afterward, the cover pressed flat, the twine retied. The morning tally was complete. There were no outstanding matters listed for that hour. The record, as it stood, showed no irregularities. One attachment was absent, but its absence had been noted and accepted. The stamp was legible enough. The reference number corresponded correctly to the index. The margins were clean. The line was finished. The book was returned to its shelf between volumes marked 1784 and 1786. The shelf inventory showed no discrepancy. The matter was closed and the day accounted for. The woman was seated on a low wooden stool in a single-room dwelling not more than a quarter mile from the parish boundary. The room had one window, its glass cloudy, admitting a flat gray light that did not shift much as the morning progressed. The door was shut. The floorboards were bare. Her hands rested in her lap, palms upward, fingers slightly curled as if holding something small and invisible. The skin across her knuckles was cracked. The fissures darkened with old dirt that washing had not removed. Her thumbs moved against the side of her forefingers in a repeated motion, slow and even, pressing, releasing, pressing again. The movement did not stop. Her shoulders were rounded forward, not from intention but from habit. When she shifted, it was only enough to relieve pressure in her lower back, a shallow adjustment that caused the stool to creak once and then settle. Her feet were flat on the floor, toes angled inward. One heel lifted and lowered again, quietly, twice before becoming still. She breathed through her mouth. Each breath was shallow, the rise of her chest slight but regular. From time to time she swallowed, her throat working visibly. Her jaw remained set, not clenched, simply held. The air in the room was cool. She wore a thin dress, the fabric worn soft at the elbows and knees. The hem brushed the tops of her feet when she leaned forward. She did not look toward the door. She did not look toward the window. Her gaze, if it could be said to rest anywhere, was directed downward toward her hands. She waited. The child lay against her, supported by the crook of her left arm. The weight was slight but constant, pressing into the muscle just above her elbow. The child's body was warm through the thin fabric, a steady heat that did not change when the woman shifted. The warmth seeped into her skin. The child smelled of milk and linen, with an undertone of something sour that clung faintly to the folds of cloth. The smell was not unpleasant, only present. The child's breathing was audible in short, uneven pulls, a soft sound that rose and fell without pattern. Occasionally there was a small noise, a wet sound at the lips, or a brief, thin whimper that did not fully form into a cry. The child's head rested against the woman's chest. The weight of it caused her to lean slightly to one side. She adjusted her arm once, lifting it a fraction higher to prevent slipping. Her fingers curled more tightly around the cloth at the child's back. The movement was careful, practiced. The child's hand, no larger than the woman's thumb, pressed against the front of her dress. The fingers opened and closed without purpose. The skin there was smooth and pale, creased at the joints. The hand fell still, then moved again, brushing the fabric. The child exhaled, a longer breath, and the sound of it filled the room briefly before fading. There was a knock at the door. It was not loud. 3 taps, evenly spaced, delivered with the flat of the knuckles rather than the fist. The sound was controlled, as if measured. The woman did not start. Her hands paused for a moment, then resumed their small motion. She did not speak. The knock came again, identical to the first. She leaned forward, placing her weight onto her feet. The stool scraped softly against the floor as she stood. The child shifted against her, making a brief sound. She adjusted her hold, pressing the child closer to her body. She crossed the room in 4 steps. Her gait was uneven, favoring one leg. At the door, she stopped long enough to shift the child to her other arm. Her free hand reached for the latch. The metal was cool. She lifted it and pulled the door inward. 2 men stood outside. They were dressed plainly, in coats that had been brushed clean. Neither wore a hat. One held a folded packet of papers against his chest. The other carried a leather folder, secured with a strap. Both men stood back from the threshold, leaving space. "Good morning," the man with the papers said. His voice was calm, pitched low. He did not raise it. The woman stepped aside without being asked. The men entered one after the other, wiping their boots on the mat just inside the door. They did not look around immediately. The man with the folder closed the door behind them. The latch clicked into place. They stood for a moment side by side, orienting themselves. The man with the papers unfolded them slightly, glancing down to confirm something. He nodded once. "Thank you," he said, though nothing had been offered. They moved efficiently. The man with the folder stepped to the small table near the wall and set it down, opening it with practiced ease. Inside were forms, stacked and aligned. He removed one and placed it flat on the table, smoothing it with his palm. The other man took a stamp from his coat pocket and tested it against a scrap of paper, pressing lightly. The room seemed to shrink as they worked. The available space narrowed, defined by their movements. The woman stood where she was, the child against her chest. She shifted her weight once, then again, settling. "We'll proceed," the man with the papers said. He did not look at her when he spoke. He read aloud from the top of the form, his voice even. Names, dates, a reference number. He paused only to align his words with the text. When he reached the end of the first section, he nodded to his companion. The stamp came down on the paper with a dull thud. The ink left a clean impression. The man with the folder reached for another document. He turned it so that the woman could see it, though he did not push it toward her. The paper bore writing and a small mark near the bottom. "Confirmation," he said. She did not respond. Her arms tightened slightly around the child. The child made a small sound, then went quiet. The men did not wait. The first man produced a thin cord from his pocket and tied it around the packet of papers, securing them together. The second adjusted the position of the form on the table, aligning it with the edge. The process moved forward without interruption. The man with the papers stepped closer. He extended his arms, palms open, angled upward. He did not touch the woman. He waited. The woman looked down at the child. Her chin dipped a fraction. Her breathing changed, becoming more shallow. She shifted the child once more, lifting slightly to ease the transfer. The movement was slow, deliberate. The child's weight left her arm. The warmth receded. The man took the child carefully, supporting the head and back. He adjusted his grip once, then held still. The child made a brief sound, louder than before, then settled. The woman's arms remained in the shape they had held the child, curved inward, empty. Her hands closed and opened once. She lowered them to her sides. Her fingers brushed the fabric of her dress. The men did not speak. The second man marked something on the form with a pencil, a short line, then another. He blew gently on the paper to dry the ink from the stamp. The transfer took less time than the reading of the documents. They waited 10 minutes. The child was placed briefly on the table on a folded cloth brought from the folder. The men checked the forms again. One of them noted the time. The stamp was applied a second time, overlapping the first by a small margin. The papers were returned to the folder. The cord was retied. The folder was closed. The man holding the child adjusted his coat. He turned toward the door. "Routine," he said, not to the woman, but to his companion, as if confirming a detail. The door was opened. The men stepped out, one after the other. The door was closed behind them. The latch clicked. The room was unchanged. The stool stood where it had been. The table held nothing now. The folded cloth was gone. The light from the window fell in the same pattern on the floor. The woman remained standing. Her arms hung at her sides. Her hands were empty. Her fingers moved once, then stopped. The air was still. There was no breathing sound where there had been one before. She did not sit. She did not move toward the door. She stood until the sound of footsteps outside faded completely. Later that afternoon, a clerk noted that item 1142B had been successfully reconciled with the district count. The missing attachment was marked as non-essential. The reference number was copied into a consolidated index. The original page would be removed the following quarter due to wear and replaced with a clean transcription. No anomalies were recorded. The room remained as it was for some time after the door closed. The air did not move. The light from the window stayed flat and colorless, falling across the floorboards in the same dull rectangle. Dust motes hung where they had been disturbed by the officials' coats and then settled again. The woman's shoulders lowered slightly, as if a tension had been released, though nothing else followed from the movement. Her hands lifted, then dropped back to her sides. She stood with her feet planted where they had been when the child was taken, the toes of her shoes still angled inward. The place against her chest where the child had rested cooled slowly, the warmth dissipating into the fabric of her dress. After several minutes, she bent at the waist and reached for the stool. The movement was careful, measured. She drew it closer to the wall and sat. The stool creaked again, the same sound as before, then went quiet. Her posture was unchanged, shoulders rounded, head inclined forward. Her hands returned to her lap, palms upward. Her thumbs resumed their slow, repetitive motion against her forefingers. The space beside her was empty. The folded cloth that had briefly rested on the table was gone. The table's surface showed a faint rectangular mark where the papers had been smoothed, lighter than the surrounding wood. The mark would fade with time. The smell in the room shifted. The faint sourness that had come from the child's clothing lingered briefly and then thinned, overtaken by the smell of old wood and damp fabric. The woman breathed through her mouth, shallowly, the rise and fall of her chest barely perceptible. She remained seated until the light changed enough to suggest the passage of hours. The window brightened slightly, then dimmed again. At some point she stood and crossed the room, her steps slow, her gait still uneven. She paused near the table, her fingers brushing its edge. She did not pick anything up. She returned to the stool and sat again. Outside, there were ordinary sounds, distant voices, the creak of a cart, the muffled clatter of hooves on packed earth. None of these entered the room clearly. The door stayed shut. By mid-afternoon, the registry from the morning had been reopened for a routine cross-check. The clerk responsible turned to item 1142B and ran his finger down the line, confirming the tick mark and the underline. He noted the overlap in the stamp, but did not comment on it. The missing attachment had already been accounted for. In the margin, he added a small numeral corresponding to the consolidated index. The index itself was a separate volume, thinner, its pages more regularly cut. Under the date October 16, 1785, the reference number appeared alongside several others. No descriptions were included. The numbers were sufficient. A second clerk verified the count and initialed the page. The ink was fresh and darker than the original entry. The page was turned. The book was closed. As evening approached, the woman moved less. She remained seated, her hands still, the small repetitive motion having ceased without ceremony. Her breathing slowed. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting against her thighs, her hands dangling loosely between her knees. The room darkened. The light from the window thinned to a gray strip and then faded. When the room was nearly dark, she stood again. She crossed to the corner where a small bundle of cloth lay folded. She knelt, her knees pressing into the floorboards, and reached into the bundle. Her fingers closed around nothing of consequence. A scrap of fabric, a loose thread. She let them fall back. She rose with effort, steadying herself against the wall. She did not light a candle. The room remained dim, the outlines of objects barely visible. She lay down on the narrow bed against the far wall. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. She turned onto her side, facing the wall. Her knees drew up a little, not fully, just enough to ease the strain in her back. Her hands rested near her chest, empty. The bed made no sound after she settled. The room was quiet. At some point after nightfall, a separate record was updated in a different building. It was a list of completed actions, compiled weekly and transferred monthly. Item 1142B appeared there as well, abbreviated, its details reduced to a single line. The handwriting was consistent with the rest of the page. A small check mark was placed beside it. The clerk noted the time of compilation, signed his name, and sanded the ink. The paper was stacked with others like it. A ribbon was tied around the bundle. The woman slept lightly. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. She shifted once during the night, the mattress creaking faintly, then went still again. There was no sound from the place beside her where the child had slept before. Morning came without ceremony. Light returned to the window, pale and indistinct. The room looked as it had the day before. The stool stood where it had been left. The table was bare. The door remained closed. She rose when the light was sufficient to see. Her movements were slower now, as if each required more effort. She sat on the stool again, her hands returning to her lap. Her thumbs pressed once against her forefingers, then stopped. She remained still. In the weeks that followed, the original ledger page containing item 1142B was flagged for replacement. The paper had begun to tear near the binding. A clean copy was made by a junior clerk, transcribing the entries line by line. In the process, the underline beneath "processed" was omitted. The red pencil tick was reproduced in ink. The overlap in the stamp was rendered as a single, neat impression. The missing attachment was not mentioned in the copy. There was no space for such notes. The original page was removed and placed in a separate folder marked for disposal. Several pages were bundled together, their corners uneven. The folder was stored temporarily, then cleared at the end of the quarter. The contents were burned with other routine waste. The consolidated index remained. The reference number stayed where it was, aligned with the date. It did not draw attention. In a later inventory, the number would appear again, carried forward, unchanged. It would sit among others like it, indistinguishable in form, verified, complete. The day advanced without deviation. By mid-morning, the parish office had received its usual foot traffic, requests for copies, minor corrections, confirmations already expected. The clerks worked from their desks, heads down, sleeves rolled to the same point on their forearms. The sound of paper shifting and pens scratching formed a steady background. No one referred back to the morning's first entries. They were already settled. At 10:15, a messenger delivered a folded notice from a neighboring district. It was logged, stamped, and placed in sequence. The stamp pad was re-inked once, the clerk pressing too firmly and leaving a darker impression than intended. He adjusted on the next page. The routine continued. Outside the office, the day was ordinary. The weather held. There was no rain. The air remained cool enough that breath was faintly visible in the early hours, and then not at all. By noon, the sun had risen high enough to cast sharper shadows along the street. People passed without stopping. In the single-room dwelling, the woman remained seated for much of the morning. When she stood, it was only to fetch water from the small pitcher near the door. She lifted it carefully, mindful of its weight. The water sloshed once against the sides, then settled. She drank in short pulls, lowering the pitcher between each. A drop ran down her chin and darkened the front of her dress. She did not wipe it away immediately. Her hand shook slightly when she set the pitcher down. She steadied it with both palms until it stopped moving. Her fingers lingered on the clay surface, feeling the coolness seep into her skin. Then she withdrew them and returned to the stool. The room no longer carried the smell of the child. The air was neutral now, tinged only with damp wood and the faint odor of smoke from elsewhere in the building. The silence was complete. There were no small sounds to interrupt it. She shifted her position several times, never fully comfortable. Each adjustment was minor. A change in the angle of her feet, a slight straightening of her back, a tilt of her head to one side and then back again. Her hands stayed empty. When they moved, it was without purpose. At some point, she reached down and brushed at the hem of her dress, smoothing a crease. The motion was slow and repeated twice. The fabric responded, lying flatter against her legs. She stopped. Shortly after noon, a supplemental form associated with item 1142B was located in a secondary stack. It was a narrow slip bearing only a date and a partial reference number. The clerk who found it compared the digits against the index and confirmed the match. He noted that the form had not been required for closure and marked it accordingly. The slip was added to a general file of non-essential documents. A pencil note in the margin read, "Resolved." The handwriting was compressed, the letters crowded together. A line was drawn beneath it. The clerk turned the page and moved on. The woman did not leave the room. The door stayed closed. Light moved slowly across the floor, shifting the shape of the rectangle near the window. Dust became visible again when the sun reached a certain angle, then disappeared as the light changed. She lay down briefly in the early afternoon, then rose again. The bed showed the faint impression of her weight. She smoothed the cover with both hands, pressing down as if to erase the mark. The mattress creaked once when she leaned over it, then fell silent. Her posture stiffened as the hours passed. When she sat, her back no longer curved as much. Her shoulders were held higher, not deliberately, but because they did not relax. Her jaw remained set. Her mouth stayed closed. She did not speak. At 2:30, the parish register was updated with the afternoon tally. The clerk counted entries, comparing them against the morning list. Item 1142B appeared once, as expected. There was no duplication. The count balanced. The clerk made a small dot beside the total and initialed it. The dot was slightly out of alignment with the others on the page. He noticed this and corrected the spacing on the next line. The register was closed again. It would not be opened until the following morning. As the light faded toward evening, the woman stood and moved to the window. She did not look out. She stood close enough that the glass reflected a faint outline of her face, indistinct and broken by imperfections in the pane. She raised one hand and touched the glass lightly, her fingertips resting against the cool surface. She left them there for several seconds, then lowered her hand. She returned to the stool and sat. Her breathing remained shallow. The room darkened steadily. No candle was lit. The shadows deepened until the edges of objects blurred together. She remained in place until the light was gone. In a different ledger, maintained for quarterly summaries, the entry corresponding to item OM 142B was condensed further. The date was retained. The reference number was abbreviated. No times were listed. The clerk responsible followed the template precisely, leaving blank spaces where the form did not require information. The page was numbered and added to the volume. The volume was placed on a shelf reserved for that year. The shelf label was straightened and checked against the inventory list. Everything matched. Night passed without incident. When morning came again, the woman rose as before. The room appeared unchanged. She sat on the stool, hands in her lap, posture fixed. The repeated motion of her thumbs did not return. The day outside began as any other. Within the records, the previous day had already receded, reduced to lines and numbers. Item 1142B was no longer current. It had been absorbed into the count, its details settled, its presence diffused among others. Nothing in the book suggested interruption. By the third morning after the entry was closed, the matter no longer appeared in daily workflows. It existed only in compiled lists and deferred references. The clerks did not speak of it. There was no reason to. The procedures governing such items did not require follow-up unless an inconsistency arose, and none had. The woman marked the morning by standing when the light reached the lower edge of the window. She did not dress differently. The same thin fabric hung from her shoulders. She moved with care, as if measuring the distance between actions. When she crossed the room, her steps were slow and evenly spaced. She paused once at the door, her hand resting briefly on the latch, then let it fall. The door remained shut. She returned to the stool and sat. Her hands rested on her thighs, palms down now, fingers extended and still. The small cracks across her knuckles had reopened slightly. A thin line of dried blood marked one joint. She rubbed it once with the pad of her thumb and stopped. The room held its shape. Nothing had shifted since the previous day. The bed was narrow and unmade. The table stood bare. The pitcher near the door was half full. The air was cool, unmoving. She waited. At mid-morning, a junior clerk was instructed to reconcile older files with the central index. He worked methodically, pulling folders, checking numbers, returning them to their places. When he reached the bundle containing the copied page from October 16th, he noted that the transcription had been completed and the original destroyed. He marked the task complete with a short diagonal line and moved on. In the margin of the reconciliation sheet, he wrote no action required. The phrase was standard. He had written it many times before. The woman stood and moved to the table. She placed both hands on its surface and leaned forward slightly, shifting her weight. The wood felt rough beneath her palms. She pressed down as if testing its solidity, then straightened. The movement left faint prints where her hands had been, darker patches that slowly faded as the moisture from her skin evaporated. She turned toward the bed and stood there for a moment, facing it. Her shoulders lifted and fell once. She did not sit. She did not lie down. She turned back toward the stool and returned to it. Her breathing remained shallow. When she inhaled, her ribs expanded visibly beneath the fabric. When she exhaled, her shoulders dropped. The pattern was steady, unvaried. Outside, the sounds of the day continued at a distance. They did not intrude. The room remained sealed, contained. Shortly before noon, a notice was posted on the parish board listing completed actions for the week. The notice was handwritten, pinned at the corners, its edges curling slightly. The items were identified only by reference number and date. Item 1142B appeared midway down the list. No one lingered to read it closely. The board was consulted briefly by those looking for other numbers. When they did not find what they sought, they moved on. The woman did not eat. There was no preparation of food. The small shelf where provisions might have been kept held only a few scraps of cloth and an empty cup. She lifted the cup once, turned it in her hands, then set it back in place. Her posture stiffened further as the day progressed. When she shifted, it was with visible effort. Her joints seemed slow to respond. She paused between movements, as if waiting for her body to comply. She remained silent. In the afternoon, a separate ledger was opened for audit. It contained entries drawn from multiple districts, consolidated for review. The handwriting varied from page to page, but the format was consistent. Dates, numbers, brief notations, no narratives. The auditor traced a line down the page with his finger, stopping briefly at item 1142B. He checked the number against the index and confirmed its presence. He initialed the margin and continued. The audit would be completed by the end of the week. No discrepancies were anticipated. As evening approached, the light in the room dimmed again. The woman stood once more and moved to the window. She rested her forehead briefly against the glass. The surface was cool. She stayed there long enough for a faint fog to appear, then stepped back. The fog dissipated quickly. She returned to the stool and sat. Her hands fell into her lap, palms inward now, fingers loosely curled. They did not move. The room darkened completely. She did not light a candle. She remained seated until the light was gone. That night, the weekly bundle of completed forms was sealed. A ribbon was tied around it, knotted firmly. A label was affixed bearing the week's dates. The bundle was placed in storage, stacked with others like it. The storage inventory was updated. The count matched. The shelf was closed. When morning came again, the woman rose as before. The room greeted her unchanged. She stood for a moment, then sat. Her hands rested where they always did. The space beside her remained empty. Within the records, the week advanced. Item 1142B moved further from the present, its relevance diminishing as newer entries took precedence. It remained intact, verified, complete. There was nothing further to be done. On the fourth day, the woman left the room for the first time since the entry was closed. She did so in the late morning, when the light had settled into a steady gray. She opened the door slowly. The hinge made a faint sound. She stepped out and closed it behind her, aligning it carefully so that the latch met cleanly. Outside, the air was cool. The ground was dry. She stood for a moment, her feet planted just beyond the threshold, as if gauging the surface. Then she walked, her pace measured, her arms held close to her sides. She did not look around. She moved along the edge of the path, keeping to the side. Her destination was not far. A small building stood at the end of the lane, its door open. She entered without being acknowledged. Inside, the space was narrow, the ceiling low. A man sat at a desk, his back straight, his hands arranged neatly on the surface before him. She stopped several steps away. Her posture was rigid, her hands hung at her sides, fingers slightly flexed. "I'm here," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not rise at the end of the sentence. The man did not look up immediately. He adjusted a paper, aligning it with the edge of the desk. Then he lifted his eyes and glanced at her. His expression did not change. "Name," he said. She gave it. He reached for a ledger and turned a page. His finger moved down the column, stopping briefly, then moving again. He nodded once. "Processed," he said. She remained standing. Her weight shifted from one foot to the other. The movement was slight, but visible. "There is nothing pending," the man continued. He spoke evenly, as if reciting. She did not respond. Her hands curled inward, then relaxed again. The man closed the ledger. The sound was soft but final. He picked up his pen and made a small mark on a separate sheet. "That is all," he said. She stood for another moment, as if waiting for something further. Nothing followed. She turned and left. The door closed behind her. When she returned to the room, the light had shifted. The rectangle on the floor lay closer to the wall now. She stood in the center of the space, her shoulders rising and falling once. Then she sat. Her movements grew more economical as the day passed. She no longer adjusted her posture as often. When she did move, it was slow and deliberate, each action isolated from the next. She lay down briefly in the afternoon, then rose again. The bed dipped and recovered. She smoothed the cover once, then left it. The room remained silent. In the parish office, a notice arrived from the regional clerk, confirming receipt of the weekly bundle. The seal was intact. The contents were listed as complete. The notice was stamped and filed. The clerk who handled it compared the listed reference numbers against the local index. Item 1142B was included. He checked it off with a short stroke of his pen. The pen scratched slightly at the end of the line. He adjusted his grip and continued. By the end of the week, the woman's movements had slowed further. She spent long periods seated, her gaze unfocused, her breathing shallow and even. She did not leave the room again. The air inside grew stale. The pitcher near the door remained half full. She drank from it sparingly, each sip small. The water level dropped slowly, almost imperceptibly. Her hands rested in her lap, palms inward. The cracks in her knuckles darkened. She did not rub them again. On the seventh day, the consolidated index for October was finalized. Pages were numbered, margins checked. A senior clerk reviewed the entries, comparing them against the original ledgers. When he reached the middle of the month, he paused briefly, then moved on. The index was signed and dated. It was placed in its designated location. The shelf inventory was updated to reflect its addition. The month, as far as the records were concerned, was settled. The woman remained in the room as evening came. The light faded. She did not rise. She did not lie down. She sat until darkness filled the space and the edges of objects disappeared. There was no sound from outside that reached her clearly. The room held its silence. In later compilations, item 1142B would be referenced only indirectly, folded into totals and summaries. Its original context would not be visible. The number would persist, unchanged, carried forward through transcriptions and indexes. There would be no annotation to distinguish it. The procedure had concluded. The records reflected completion. The following days passed without formal acknowledgement. No notices were posted. No additional visits were scheduled. The room remained sealed by habit rather than instruction. The woman rose when there was light and sat when there was not. The distinction between morning and afternoon narrowed until it was marked only by the angle of illumination on the floor. Her body showed the passage of time in small ways. Her shoulders slumped more deeply when she sat. When she stood, it took longer for her to straighten. Her hands, when they moved at all, did so stiffly, as if the joints resisted. She drank water once each day, sometimes less. The pitcher grew lighter. She did not speak again. The room itself began to show minor signs of occupation without activity. Dust accumulated along the edges of the floorboards. The stool's legs left shallow impressions where they pressed into the wood. The bed remained unmade. The table's surface dulled. There were no new sounds. Within the parish system, the matter required nothing further. The forms associated with that week had been archived. The clerks turned their attention to newer entries. Templates were reused. Headings were copied forward. Dates advanced. Standard language governed the handling of completed items. Once processed, entries were not revisited unless a discrepancy arose. Discrepancies were defined narrowly. Missing numbers, conflicting counts, illegible stamps. None applied. Delays were discouraged. Efficiency was noted. Completion was preferred. At the end of the month, a consolidation took place at the district level. Ledgers were reviewed, indexes compared, redundancies eliminated. Where multiple references pointed to the same action, only one was retained. Supporting notes were removed if deemed unnecessary. Item 1142B appeared in the consolidation as a single line. The date remained. The reference number remained. No names were included. The line was aligned with others above and below it. Spacing was consistent. A clerk drew a line through a column no longer in use. The ink was darker there, the pressure heavier. He initialed the page. The woman's presence in the room became quieter. She spent long stretches seated without visible movement. When she did rise, it was often only to shift position, to ease pressure in her legs or back. Her breathing remained shallow. At night, it was sometimes irregular, punctuated by long pauses that resolved on their own. The space beside her remained empty. Objects stayed where they had been left. Nothing was added. Nothing was removed. In the following quarter, a directive was issued to reduce storage. Older files were reviewed for relevance. Items deemed complete and sufficiently documented were cleared. Original pages that had already been transcribed were selected first. Bundles were untied. Pages were checked quickly. Those without annotations or outstanding notes were set aside. Ink smudges, overlapping stamps, marginal marks were not considered grounds for retention. The pages were burned with others, the ash collected and discarded. The consolidated index endured. It was bound more tightly than the ledgers, its pages sturdier. It traveled forward into subsequent summaries. The reference number persisted, unchanged, carried into tables and counts where it lost even the context of its original date. It became indistinguishable from those around it. When the season changed, the room remained closed. The woman continued to occupy it, rising and sitting by the light. Her movement slowed further. The stool creaked less often. The pitcher was refilled once, then not again. No official came to check the space. There was no requirement to do so. Years later, when an inventory was conducted to reconcile historical volumes, a gap was noted in the original ledger sequence for late 1785. The missing pages were listed as destroyed per standard practice. A notation was added to the inventory to reflect this. The index showed no gap. The matter, as recorded, remained complete. Time passed without formal markers. The days were no longer counted against a ledger in the room, but they continued to accrue. The woman's routine reduced itself to a narrow set of actions. She rose when the light allowed her to see the floor. She sat. She drank water when the dryness in her mouth became difficult to ignore. She lay down when her legs no longer supported her weight. Each action occurred without urgency and without variation. Her body occupied less space as the weeks advanced. Her shoulders drew inward. When she sat, her spine curved more sharply. The fabric of her dress hung looser across her frame. The cracks in her hands widened, then stabilized. She no longer rubbed them. The room adjusted to her presence in subtle ways. Dust settled in thicker lines along the walls. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint odor of stale water and old cloth. The stool remained in the same position. The bed showed a shallow, permanent depression. No one came. At the administrative level, the quarter closed. Summaries were prepared and forwarded. Totals were compared across districts. Where numbers aligned, no commentary was added. Where they did not, the discrepancy was flagged and investigated. Item L142B did not generate any such mark. It fell within expected ranges. A senior clerk signed the quarterly report. His signature was practiced, the flourish at the end consistent with previous documents. The report was sealed and sent onward. The language used was standard, processed, verified, complete. The woman's breathing changed as the weather cooled. Each inhalation appeared to require more effort. When she exhaled, there was sometimes a faint sound, barely audible. She did not adjust her posture to compensate. She remained seated for longer periods, rising less often. When she lay down, she did so carefully, turning onto her side. Her hands rested near her chest, fingers loosely curled. The space beside her remained untouched. She slept lightly, waking and settling again without fully rising. There were long intervals where she did not move at all. In the following year, a revision of filing practices was introduced. Older reference numbers were retained, but stripped of secondary annotations to improve clarity. Marginal notes were removed in copied versions. Red pencil marks were not reproduced. During this process, several entries from late 1785 were standardized. Item 1142B was among them. Its line was cleaned, its spacing adjusted. The absence of an attachment was no longer indicated. The underline beneath "processed" did not appear in the revised copy. The revision was approved. The updated volume replaced the older one on the shelf. The woman remained in the room through the change of seasons. Light shifted differently across the floor. The air grew colder. She wrapped her arms closer to her body when she sat, but did not seek additional covering. The dress she wore was the same one she had worn on the morning the door had been opened. Her movement slowed further. When she stood, It took several moments before she could take a step. She paused between actions, as if waiting for instruction that did not come. The pitcher near the door remained empty. She did not refill it again. No record was made of her condition. There was no form for it. No clerk was assigned to note the state of a single room beyond its relevance to an index or a count. Within the system, her existence had no designation. Decades later, when a comprehensive catalog of surviving parish records was compiled, several gaps were noted in the physical holdings for the year 1785. Fire, damp, and routine disposal were listed as causes. The catalog referenced consolidated indexes as substitutes where originals were missing. Item 1142B appeared there, intact, its reference number clear. There was no accompanying narrative. There was no indication that anything had followed from it. The catalog entry was stamped and dated. It was added to the archive. Nothing in the record suggested that the entry was unusual. In the early spring following the revision, an inspection was carried out to reconcile physical spaces with recorded obligations. The inspection list was brief. It concerned buildings owned, leased, or otherwise designated for official use. Private dwellings were not included unless a discrepancy had been filed. No discrepancy had been filed. The list was reviewed, signed, and returned. No amendments were made. The woman remained in the room. By then, her movements were minimal. When she rose, it was with visible effort, her hands braced against the stool or the wall. She sat more often than she stood. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, punctuated by long pauses that resolved without intervention. The light continued to come and go. The rectangle on the floor appeared each day and disappeared again. Dust thickened along the edges of the room. The air grew colder. The woman drew her arms closer to her body when she sat, but she did not add layers. The fabric of her dress frayed further at the cuffs. At some point, she lay down and did not rise again. The bed took her weight and held it. Her breathing continued for a time, irregular and faint. When it stopped, there was no sound to mark the change. The room remained still. No official record was generated to note the cessation. There was no mechanism requiring one. The dwelling did not fall under routine inspection. The absence of activity did not trigger review. Outside, the days advanced. Other entries were processed. Other forms were stamped. Other reference numbers were assigned, verified, closed. Years later, during a broad consolidation of 18th-century materials, an archivist noted that several reference numbers from October 1785 appeared only in secondary indexes. The original ledgers were missing, listed as destroyed according to policy. The archivist confirmed that the indexes were sufficient for continuity and marked the matter resolved. Item 1142B was among those confirmed. Its line was clear. The date was legible. The reference number matched across volumes. There were no marginal notes. The archivist initialed the page and moved on. In a separate effort to standardize archival descriptions, descriptive language was reduced. Entries were stripped to their functional elements: date, number, status. Words like routine and verified were retained. Notations regarding missing attachments were removed to prevent confusion. The revised catalog was approved. The older version was withdrawn. The shelves holding the consolidated indexes were inspected and found to be in order. The labels were aligned. The inventory matched the contents. No corrective action was required. The archive, as a whole, was deemed stable. Nothing in the surviving materials indicated interruption, resistance, or error. The procedures reflected compliance. The forms reflected completion. The counts balanced. There were other reference numbers from other days. recorded in the same hand, stamped with the same instruments, verified in the same manner. They occupied the pages before and after, indistinguishable in format, aligned in sequence. The system preserved them all equally. The records do not indicate that this one required special attention. In the last review of that year's materials, conducted without urgency and without ceremony, the remaining volumes were checked against a master list. The list was typed later, copied from handwritten sources, its columns straightened for ease of reading. Dates were normalized, reference numbers were aligned, status fields were reduced to a single term, closed. Item 1142B appeared there, as it had everywhere else. The date was correct. The number matched. The status was unambiguous. There were no flags. There was no space allocated for attachments, missing or otherwise. A clerk compared the master list to the consolidated index and drew a line through the verification column. He initialed the page. The ink dried evenly. The page was turned. When the physical archive was reorganized years afterward, certain shelves were condensed. Volumes that duplicated information were removed. Ledgers that had been superseded by indexes were identified and set aside. Their spines were checked, their contents confirmed against summaries. Where confirmation existed, the volumes were marked redundant. A stamp was applied to the inside cover of each. Superseded. They were transferred to a holding area. Space was needed. The holding area was cleared at the end of the season. Boxes were opened. Pages were glanced at, not read. Numbers were checked quickly, then checked off. Where an index existed, the originals were deemed unnecessary. The process was documented. The documentation was filed. In the final catalog entry that survives, item 1142B is listed without elaboration. It is one line among many. The formatting is identical. The font is uniform. There is no indication of deviation, delay, or exception. The catalog notes that some source materials for the period are incomplete. It attributes this to standard causes. No corrective action is recommended. The catalog is dated. It is signed. It is approved. Nothing in the remaining records specifies the room. Nothing names the woman. Nothing records the child beyond weight and count, abstracted into totals. The day itself is preserved only as a sequence of timestamps that align properly. The entries before and after are the same. There is no annotation to suggest that this line required memory. There is no mark to separate it from others processed in the same hand, on the same morning, under the same rules. The archive closes on it without pause, and the sequence continues.